Just Ehren here, Question Period Canada. We've got a very fiery debate between Trudeau and Poilievre. It's going to be fun because Poilievre beats Trudeau's butt over 20 times. Many questions, very few answers. Trudeau is dividing and distracting Canadians as per usual. Poilievre is there to keep him in place. Let's jump right into it. Poilievre beating up Trudeau over 20 times. Let's go.
Speaker, these are the same promises he made 8 years ago before he doubled housing costs. He's not worth the cost of housing, which is up 100%. In the last 2 years alone, according to rent.ca, the rent is up 20% or $400 for the average family. And now we learn that construction is in free fall, down 28% last December versus the December before. Will he stop funding bureaucracy and driving up interest rates so that we can bring homes Canadians can afford?
Our housing ambition can be best summed up by the Conservative member for Dufferin-Caledon, who said that it seems that every day our Minister of Housing has a new program, a new announcement, or a new check for Canadians. That's exactly right, Mr. Speaker. We continue to work hand in hand with Canadians, with municipalities across the country, municipalities he'd rather insult, to get more homes built faster, Mr. Speaker. The investments we're making, including things like taking the GST off purpose-built rental housing, which the Conservatives voted against, will continue to create more homes for Canadians right across the country.
Mr. Speaker, you can't live in announcements and programs. You need homes that have walls and floors and ceilings. The Prime Minister doing another selfie in front of a construction site won't do that. In fact, construction is down 28% in December after 8 years of this Prime Minister's promises and spending. Will he accept our common sense plan to build homes and not bureaucracy?
Speaker, just last week I was in Kitchener-Waterloo making an announcement for the Housing Accelerator program for Waterloo. And what the Leader of the Opposition seemed to have missed is we were standing in a freshly completed building for seniors that $33 million of funding from the federal government a few years ago allowed to be built today. We are building things today that people are moving into in the coming weeks, and we are announcing how we are building things for tomorrow, as opposed to him who just chooses to insult Canadians, insult mayors, and insult our intelligence.
After 8 years, the port authorities are only scanning or inspecting 1% of shipping containers leaving our ports. And that led to the case where Mark Roos had his 2021 Dodge Ram stolen. Luckily, he had an Apple AirTag, so he could follow its transit to the Port of Montreal, where he knows it to be. He called both the cops and the Port Authority, both of which said they don't know which box it's in, so they can't find it. So why won't he accept my common sense plan to buy 24 scanners so we can scan the boxes, find the Dodge Ram, and give it back to Mark?
While Conservatives cut frontline border services officers, along with cuts to the RCMP, cuts to police forces across the country, we invested in them, and we're going to continue to do that with $121 million for Ontario, more investments for port and border security. We're going to continue to step up and keep Canadians safe.
Your strength is not math, but the facts are that we took office, there were about 12,000 working as CBSA officials, and when we left office, there were over 14,000. So 14,000 is more than 12,000 to help the Prime Minister with the numbers. It's true that we cut back office bureaucracy and high-priced consultants, which he has ballooned, and that's why after 8 years, he has increased auto theft by 32%. Will he accept our common sense plan to cut high-priced consultants and hire more front-line inspectors?
I can't help but smile when the Leader of the Opposition talks about high-priced consultants, because it's his campaign being run by a high-priced consultant for Loblaws. When he stands in this place and across the country wrenching his heartstrings about the prices that Canadians are paying for groceries, when his top advisor is in the pocket of Loblaws, giving him the same talking points as she gives Galen Weston when he appeared at Parliamentary Committee. Mr. Speaker, if Canadians are going to believe this Leader of the Opposition, he needs to come clean with who is funding his organizations.
Sure getting desperate if he has to blame Conservative campaign workers for the fact that he raised food prices, especially when, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's new marketing director, Max Veliket, did marketing for Loblaws for 4 years. Don Guy, the Prime Minister's chief pollster, works for GT & Co., which collects checks from Loblaws. As does Dan Arnold, his other pollster, getting checks from Loblaws. Are they the ones that forced him to quadruple the carbon tax on our food?
Wednesday, because this morning the members of the Conservative caucus got to hear directly from Jenny Byrne, who sits in their caucus with them, giving them advice. So that is exactly where they're coming. When she is actively on the Loblaw's payroll, while at the same time feeding lines to the Leader of the Opposition about food prices and concocting a theory around carbon price and grocery prices that, as the member from Regina Louvain pointed out yesterday, has no basis in fact. We see the kind of torque he chooses to pull.
Speaker, he makes it too easy. He talks about caucus meetings and Loblaws. Get this. The Prime Minister had someone who is his director of caucus services named Julie DeWolf, who is now a lobbyist for Loblaws. A lot of dirt. His chief dirt digger, Kevin Bosch, left his office so that he could go and work as a lobbyist for Loblaws. Would he like us to continue going down the list of all of his Loblaws lobbyists, Mr. Speaker?
It is quite something to watch the flailing of the Conservatives right now as they do anything to try to distract from the fact that their campaign manager, the Leader of the Opposition's top advisor, is and still gets contributions and paychecks from Loblaws. This is an issue when he has stood up and pretended to care about food prices, when we hear the exact same talking points come out of Galen Weston's mouth as out of the Leader of the Opposition's mouth on some invented connection between the price on pollution and grocery prices, we know exactly who is behind the Conservative Party.
The crime, Mr. Speaker. He unleashed the car theft crisis by bringing in house arrest and bail, not jail, for repeat career car thieves, and by allowing our ports to become sieves where our cars are stolen from, so much so that we're now becoming world famous for the Prime Minister's failures. The Ghana Economic and Organized Crime Office says we are in possession of stolen vehicles. The victims, it's all in Canada. No Canadian agency has approached us directly or made a formal complaint. Will he take the money from the back office bureaucrats and consultants and put it into frontline law enforcement to protect our cars?
The Leader of the Opposition likes to make base political accusations. He likes to talk about C5 and C75 as the reason there is auto theft in this country. The reality is C5 is the bill that keeps mandatory minimum penalties for car theft on the books, and C75 is the bill that raises the maximum penalty on car theft. We've continued to step up in terms of keeping Canadians safe. We will continue to invest in the CBSA and in the resources necessary to counter these challenges. We will keep working based on facts and evidence, Mr. Speaker.
Here are the actual facts. Let's go through them. C5 keeps mandatory prison sentences. Mr. Speaker, they were already in place, put there by the previous Conservative government. They weren't created by C5. What C5 did is it brought in house arrest for career car thieves so they can watch Netflix or perhaps play Grand Theft Auto in their living room and then go out onto the street and steal another car whenever they want. Will he follow my common sense plan to end house arrest for career car thieves?
Speaker, in the Leader of the Opposition's simplistic worldview, someone sitting on their couch at home playing video games goes out and steals an Escalade. That's not what happens, Mr. Speaker. Organized crime is directly involved in the mass massive spike in auto thefts in this country. That's why what we're stepping up on in investment in anti-organized crime, investments against money laundering that party voted against, investments in more powers and more resources for Ontario to counter auto theft, and indeed more resources for the CBSA that they cut when they last left office.
Speaker, actually, people do steal cars when they're on house arrest because all they have to do is open the door and walk out and steal the car. Then there's his bail policy, which allowed the same 40 offenders to be arrested 6,000 times in Vancouver in a year, many of them car thieves. So, will he accept my common sense plan to get rid of house arrest and bring in jail, not bail, for career car thieves? Yes or no?
Speaker, in all the questions the Leader of the Opposition asked about car theft, he hasn't once mentioned organized crime, which is the cause of car theft in this country right now. And that's why perhaps he's not mentioning it, because when we brought forward measures to counter organized crime and money laundering, the Conservative Party voted against them. We moved forward with more resources for Ontario, $121 million to counter organized crime and car theft. The Conservative Party voted against. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to anchor ourselves in facts and data and deliver on keeping Canadians safe.
He wants facts. Here's another fact. Extortions are up 218% since he took office. Right. Why? Because he got rid of mandatory jail time for extortion with a weapon. So now he allows extortionists to go around with guns, harassing small business owners in Brampton, in Surrey, in Calgary, and Edmonton, where horror stories are unfolding. Will he agree to our common sense plan to reverse catch and release so that Canadians are safe from extortion?
The situation faced by far too many people across this country around extortion from organized crime is unacceptable, and that is why we are taking action directly with the RCMP and local police forces to counter it. But once again, we see Conservatives falling into the same far-right American trap in their approach on crime that doesn't work, that doesn't keep Canadians safe, that it sounds good in sound bites and attacks, but doesn't actually deliver safer communities. It's like their opposition to gun control and their desire to put assault-style weapons back on the streets. They don't keep Canadians safe. The work we does.
Talk about the cold, hard facts. There were 2/3 less cases of extortion in the last year of the common sense Conservative government than there are today. In the 10 years we were in office, the number of car thefts fell by half. And that was because we targeted the worst offenders, kept them in prison, we secured our ports, and stopped organized crime. The Prime Minister has only multiplied crime with his catch and release policies. Will he follow the evidence and reinstate a common sense criminal justice?
From the Leader of the Opposition is under the previous Conservative government, everything was perfect, and what he is proposing to do is to make Canada great again. That is not what Canadians want. He is pining for a nostalgia that, quite frankly, Canadians do not feel. They remember what he did as part of Stephen Harper's failed housing minister. He remembers the people who, the rights of Indigenous peoples violated, the ignoring of environmental responsibilities, and the lack of an environmental and economic plan for the future. We're going to continue.
After 8 years, the Prime Minister is not worth the cost of housing, which has doubled since he promised to lower it. Now we have a brand new phenomenon of the middle class homeless. In fact, according to the Executive Director of the Royal Canadian Legion of Nova Scotia, members of the Canadian Forces are now forced to live in tents, in cars, and to couch surf. There are 30 homeless encampments in Halifax after 8 years of this Prime Minister. But why would the Prime Minister then plan to go ahead with a $450 a year rent increase to our armed forces members who are already forced to live in tents?
Military members and their families are a priority, and we're taking steps to ensure that they are supported. We're investing $445 million over the coming years to tackle the supply of military housing. And when the Conservatives had an opportunity to support our military personnel, they chose not to. The Conservatives stood up in this House and voted against supporting our men and women in uniform just last December.
It's an outrageous non-response to the men and women who put their lives on the line for this country. He rewards them with a tent or a couch in someone else's basement to sleep in. After 8 years of this Prime Minister, there's a 177% increase in Bagotville and a 261% increase in the wait line for military housing. And now he plans a $450 rent increase on the people who protect our country. Shouldn't he be ashamed of himself?
We'll take no lessons from the Conservatives who nickel and dimed our military service members and veterans through 9 years of their time in office and even dropped military funding to below 1% of GDP, Mr. Speaker. We will continue to step up, including with $445 million for military housing in the coming years as we continue to honor and support the women and men who serve our country with their lives.
He honors them with a tent to live in. He honors them with a $450 increase in their rent. Before this Prime Minister, we didn't have masses of military members living in tent cities, Mr. Speaker. They could put a roof overhead. In fact, we didn't have 30 tent cities in Halifax. We didn't have 2 million people lined up at food banks in lines that are reminiscent of the Great Depression. We didn't have young people forced to wait till they're age 40 to get a home. The good news is life was not like this before this Prime Minister, and it won't be like this after he's gone.
Why doesn't he just say it straight out, Mr. Speaker? He's planning to make Canada great again. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, Canada is great. Canada is the best country in the world. And yes, there are challenges, and that's why we're stepping up to invest, whether it's $445 million for military housing, whether it's stepping up with dental care for vulnerable seniors or youth, whether it's cutting child care fees in half, Mr. Speaker, whether it's continuing to step up for vulnerable youth. We are going to be there for Canadians while he proposes cuts to services, cuts to programs, and cuts to the supports that Canadians need.
So that's what the Prime Minister has to say to the 2 million people lined up around street corners clamoring for the food bank after 8 years. That things are just going great. To the people in Montreal who've seen their rent quadruple after his 8 years, life is just great for them too. To the Torontonians who have to spend 25 years now saving up for the down payment on the average home, he says things are just great. How can he possibly fix the misery he caused if he can't even realize that it's right in front of his face?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition may not think that Canada is the best country in the world, but we do. And the reality is we recognize Canadians are struggling right now, and that is why we continue to invest in supports for them, whether it's cutting childcare fees in half, whether it's investing in the kinds of jobs and careers we're going to need in the #1 battery supply chain country in the world, in drawing in significant investments right across the country, in moving forward into a brighter economic future, while we recognize that Canadians need support now. He offers fear and cuts while we offer support and a brighter future. That's what we're going to continue.
Is not worth the cost of food after 8 years of the NDP Liberal carbon tax. It's caused food prices to rise 20% in the last 2 years alone. So much for the affordable food they promised when they signed their coalition with the NDP leader. So much so that the Canada Food Bank is now forced to cut in half the number of potatoes that they're giving out. It's too expensive and there's too much demand. Instead of just telling those people who are eating half as much in Canada that things are great, why won't he follow our common sense plan to axe the tax?
As the member for Regina Louvain recognized yesterday, there is absolutely no data to support any link between our price on pollution and higher grocery prices. There simply is none. On this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, we are a government anchored in evidence and data, and we will continue to be there to deliver things like a grocery rebate to Canadians, to put more money back in Canadians' pockets, even as we put a price on pollution with the carbon price rebate, and we will continue to defend Canadians' interests against the cuts proposed by that Conservative.
He wants to know the link between the carbon tax and the food price. Well, I'll help him out. So farmers use something called diesel. It goes in their tractors and combines and drying machines. It goes in their off-farm fuels that pay the carbon tax, on which he wants to quadruple the tax. Then the truckers who pick up the food, transport it to the grocery store, pay the carbon tax. Then the grocer pays the carbon tax to power the heat in that big Olympic stadium-size chamber we call a grocery store. If he doesn't get the link, how is he ever going to fix the problem?
The problem with the story that the Leader of the Opposition just told is there's absolutely no data to support it. He is all about political attacks. He is all about inventing reasons to not take action on the fight against climate change, because his Conservative Party still doesn't understand that you cannot have a plan for Canadians' future or the future of the economy if you don't have a plan to fight climate change. Not only are we fighting climate change, Mr. Speaker, we're putting more money back in the pockets of Canadians and building the economy of the future.
Mr. Speaker, speaking of no evidence, we actually filed an order paper question asking for proof that his carbon tax is reducing emissions, and it came back that there was no evidence. For 8 years in government, after years of raising the tax, they have no proof that it reduces emissions at all. But we know it increases food prices, and this is why Canada's food professor said, I'm recommending a pause on the carbon tax for the entire food industry, from farm gate to store and restaurants. If the Prime Minister doesn't have the common sense to axe the tax, will he listen to the food professor and cancel his plan to hike it?
Mr. Speaker, Canada is actually reducing its emissions faster than our G7 partners, largely because we put a price on pollution. Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition wants to make pollution free again. We do not think that is the right path for Canada. We know that investing in reduction of carbon emissions while putting more money back in Canadians' pockets, switching from home heating oil to heat pumps, moving forward in responsible ways as we're investing in supporting Canadians is the way to build a stronger future, but he proposes ideology, cuts, and fear tactics, Mr. Speaker.
It's been 8 years since this costly Prime Minister took office, but it was 2 years ago that he signed a deal with the NDP leader where in the latter promised that it would bring more affordable food. Since that time, the NDP and Liberals have helped raise food prices by 20%. Their favorite inflationary instrument is the carbon tax. Now they plan to quadruple the carbon tax on the farmer who produces the food and the trucker who ships the food, and therefore all who buy the food. The Canada's food professor is calling for a cap on the carbon tax. Will the Prime Minister cancel his 23% carbon tax hike for April 1st?
Once again, we heard in Parliamentary Committee yesterday absolutely no evidence, no data to support the Leader of the Opposition's contention that the price on pollution impacts on grocery prices. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, our price on pollution returns 4 times a year more money to 80% of Canadians in the areas where it is in play than it costs them. That's how we can both fight against climate change and put more money in the pockets of Canadians. The Leader of the Opposition is proposing to take away those 4 times a year rebate checks from Canadians.
Speaker, the NDP also promised affordable housing when they sold out their constituents and signed on to a coalition with the Leader of the Liberals. But since that time, the rent is up well over 20% as they fund more bureaucracy to block homes and deficits that drive up interest rates, so much so that Tim Chen, a student in Vancouver, actually needs to commute to university from Calgary. Yes, he has to fly back to Calgary where he can afford the rent under a Conservative government, and then fly over to Vancouver in a commute in order to study. Mr. Speaker, how crazy is it that you have to commute across?
Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition likes to talk about the challenges Canadians are facing, and while we're busy solving them, he's proposing nonsensical solutions. Let's talk about the Conservative leader's housing plan. It won't build homes fast enough, it doesn't reach enough cities, and it creates unnecessary bureaucracy. He'll also rip up our housing accelerator agreements, which are unlocking 500,000 new homes, and he'd put the GST back on apartment construction. Housing experts like Mike Moffat say his plan is exceptionally weak and a sign that, to quote, the Conservatives don't understand the scale of the housing crisis. We'll take no less.
The results speak for themselves. When I was the housing minister, rent was $950. It's now over $2,000. When I was the housing minister, the average mortgage payment on a newly purchased home was $1,400. It's now over $3,500. And my common sense plan would require cities permit 15% more home building as a condition of getting federal money, require they build housing around transit stations rather than having empty fields there, and sell off 6,000 federal buildings and thousands of acres of federal land to build. Why won't he build homes instead of building bureaucracy?
The reality is Canadians just can't trust Conservatives and their attacks and their talking points. Why? Because an active paid lobbyist is the one giving them all their advice on how to win their campaign. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, the big business and money behind the Conservative Party is once again driving their agenda as they propose cuts to vulnerable Canadians, underinvestments in housing, and no solutions to the very real challenges Canadians are facing. They're in the pocket of big business, as evidenced by Jenny Byrne's work for Loblaw.
After watching Poilievre beat up Trudeau for 20 questions, Trudeau just dodging questions, I think if Canadians see him in action, Trudeau is going to show Canadians that he's just a dishonest guy by now. Maybe he didn't used to be. He is now, it seems to me. Like, I used to trust him. I wouldn't. I don't trust him as far as I could throw him. And I think most Canadians, if they see this stuff, are going to feel the same. I'm Ehren. This is Question Period Canada. Hope you enjoyed the fiery debate. That was pretty hot. And there's more to come. We've got lots of videos. Like, subscribe, get notified. We do a lot of live stuff on here. It's great. We do some funny shorts, trying to have some fun. That's it. Yeah, I'm Ehren. Check out the next video. Can't wait to see you. Thanks for watching. Stay warm. Have something healthy to eat today.